friends, this video on class 10 biology revision is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. So first of all, we would like to discuss about the priority of the chapters that we have in biology or their weightage. So these are the 6 chapters that you have to study in your class 10th biology. That is how do organisms reproduce, heredity and evolution, our environment, life processes, control and coordination, and management of natural resources. Now, if you talk about the priority, these 2 chapters are like the highest priority. So, normally in a class 10 biology question paper, in fact, in class 10 science board exams question paper, you can expect 11 to 12 questions of biology in total. And out of that, you can very well expect 4 to 5 questions from these 2 lessons itself. So they are that important, yes. Next is our environment, and our environment is of medium priority. However, you can expect maybe some 2 questions from this chapter. So basically our environment, life processes and control and coordination. These are all medium priority chapters, and you can expect a total of maybe 3 to 4 questions from all of these chapters. Now, life processes and control and coordination, sometimes you do not get much questions from these chapters, but you never know, sometimes you also get questions. And finally, the last chapter, which is management of natural resources, that is a low priority chapter, and you can just expect maybe 1 question or at the max 2 from this chapter. Okay. So without wasting any further time, let's go ahead with the first lesson, that is how do organisms reproduce. This is like a high priority chapter. So in this chapter, the important topics that we're going to cover is sexual versus asexual reproduction, types of asexual reproduction, sexual reproduction in plants, male reproductive system in humans, female reproductive system in humans, process of sexual reproduction in humans, contraception methods, and sexually transmitted diseases. Okay, so let's start with sexual versus asexual reproduction. So these are the 2 modes of reproduction, as we know. So asexual reproduction means you need a single parent to produce a new organism. So you basically do not need a mother and a father. Just one organism can give rise to new organisms. In this case, there is no sex involved. This is an easier and faster mode of reproduction, and there are no genetic variations involved. So in this case, what happens is the new organism that is formed, it is an identical copy of the parent organism. Whereas on the other hand, when we talk about sexual reproduction, here we need 2 parents, and there is sex involved between the 2 parents. That is, there has to be a fusion between the male and the female gametes. Gametes are nothing but the sex cells, and then this fusion will give rise to a new organism. So here it is a relatively slower mode of reproduction, but in this case genetic variations are seen. So here the new organism that is formed, that organism might have some similarities with both of the parents, but it can also have some new characteristics. So genetic variations are seen in this case. Now, if we talk about the types of asexual reproduction, the first one is fission. Now, fission is basically the process where an organism splits to form new organism. Now, what do we mean when we say splits? So basically the nucleus divides. Right? Now, fission again are of 2 types. One is binary fission, where an organism splits into 2 halves. And there is another one which is called multiple fission, where an organism splits into multiple halves. Now, fission is seen in organisms like amoeba, paramecium, euglena, whereas multiple fission is seen in organisms like plasmodium. So basically you see fission as a mode of reproduction in case of the unicellular or simple organisms. Next is budding. So in budding, there is a small outgrowth which is seen on the parent's body like this. So you can see this small outgrowth. This is called a bud, and it gradually grows, become a new organism, and then detaches itself from the parent. And budding is seen in organisms like yeast, hydra. Next is fragmentation. So fragmentation is seen in multicellular organisms like Spirogyra. And what happens in fragmentation? The parent breaks into pieces on maturity, and each of these pieces give rise to a new organism. So if this Spirogyra, when it becomes mature, it splits into maybe 3 halves, and each of those halves give rise to a new organism. So that's fragmentation. The fourth one is regeneration. So what is regeneration? So regeneration is an accidental process. For example, now regeneration is seen in organisms like flatworm, tapeworm. So here the picture that you see is of a planaria. Now normally what happens is, if this planaria accidentally gets broken into pieces, now each of these pieces has the ability to regenerate. That means each of these pieces can form the new organism once again. So that is called regeneration. Now many a times you get a question that how is regeneration different from reproduction? So reproduction basically is a process which happens naturally on its own. That means when an organism becomes mature, it reproduces to form new organisms. But in case of regeneration, it is not basically a natural like reproduction thing. It is an accidental process. If by chance the organism gets split or gets broken into pieces, then each of those pieces will have the ability to form a new organism. Okay, so moving ahead, we have spore formation. So in spore formation, so the spore formation is seen in organisms like Rhizopus. So here you see these are sporangia which contains the spores. Now these spores are nothing but unicellular bodies which are seen on the parents, and these spores are capable of growing into new organisms. And finally the last one, which is vegetative propagation. So vegetative propagation is again a mode of asexual reproduction in plants. So here what we do is plant parts are detached from the parent, and then they are capable of forming a new plant. Now there are two types of vegetative propagation. One is natural vegetative propagation, the other one is artificial vegetative propagation. Now when we talk about natural vegetative propagation, it can happen from various parts of the plants. It can happen by roots, by stems, or by leaves. For example, you can see vegetative propagation by roots in case of sweet potato, dahlia, or guava, where buds develop in the thick fleshy roots. Similarly, you can see natural vegetative propagation by stem in case of plants like grass or strawberry, like as you see here, where the stems, they grow horizontally above the ground, and at nodes new roots develop. So since new roots develop, so a new plant develops altogether. So not only that, in case of potato, ginger, or onion, you have underground stems, and buds appear in these underground stems and give rise to new plant. And we also give them different names. For example, the underground stem of potato is known as tuber. The same in case of ginger is known as rhizome. In case of onion is called bulb. And then you can also see vegetative propagation by leaves, like as in case of bryophyllum. So in bryophyllum, if you see, along the leaf margins, buds appear, and from these buds new plants develop. So these are various modes of natural vegetative propagation. Now let's talk about the artificial vegetative propagation. So the first way to artificially vegetatively propagate plants is cutting. That means you cut a part of the plant and then you put it in the soil, take care of it, and it gives rise to a new plant. For example, stem cutting in case of rose. You take a stem, cut a stem of a rose plant, put it in the soil, water it regularly, and it gives you a new plant. Similarly, root cutting in case of dahlia. You take a root, put it in the soil, take care of it, it gives rise to a new plant. So that's cutting. Next is layering. So what happens in layering? So there are two types of layering again. One is mound layering and the other one is air layering. So this is an example of mound layering, in which an aerial branch is like pulled to the ground and then it is covered with moist soil, like as you see here. And then it is found that after some time new roots develop from that part, and as a result a new plant develops. So that's mound layering. Similarly, you have something called air layering. So in air layering, an aerial branch is scraped and it is covered with mud, like this part is covered with mud, it is covered with a plastic, and it is seen that later new roots develop from this part. So that time you can detach this part and grow it as a new plant. So that is air layering. Similarly, you have a third kind of artificial vegetative propagation called grafting. So in grafting, what happens is stems cut from two different plants, they are attached to grow as a single plant. So this part, one part is called the scion, the other part is called the stalk. So the purpose of stalk is to provide minerals and nutrients to this overall plant. So the combination of lemon and orange is one such example. So you take one part out of the scion and the stalk from the lemon, the other part from the orange. Now by doing these kind of mix and match between two different plants, it improves the quality of certain plants. So these are the various modes of asexual reproduction, and you often get questions from one of these types. Now let's move on to sexual reproduction. So obviously in sexual reproduction, you have involvement of sex cells. Now these sex cells, that is the male and the female gametes, in certain organisms, they are identical to each other. For example, Chlamydomonas, Spirogyra. So these are some examples where the male and female gametes are identical. Whereas in some other organisms, the male and female gametes are different from each other. Example is human beings. So in case of human beings, if you look at the male gamete, it is very smaller in size and it is motile. It can move from one place to another, whereas the female gamete is comparatively larger in size and it is not motile. It is primarily used for food storage. So this is the female gamete, that is ovum, and this is the male gamete, that is sperm. So this is the male gamete and this is the female gamete. Okay, and the fusion of this male and female gametes gives rise to a new organism. Okay, so now let's talk about sexual reproduction in plants. So in plants, the reproductive organ is a flower. So you have two categories of flower. One is unisexual, where you have either the male or the female reproductive part in a flower. So the flower either has male part or the female part. For example, papaya, watermelon. So you have one of these parts. So these are unisexual flowers. Whereas you might come across flowers which have both the male and the female reproductive parts within it. For example, China rose or mustard. So these are the two types of flowers. Now the most important part is flower structure. So when we talk about the structure, we will just quickly go through their function. So stalk is nothing but this tube-like structure which holds the flower. And then is thalamus, which is the swollen upper portion of the stalk. This portion is thalamus. And then is petals, that is the colored part of the flowers which attracts insects. In this case, the petals are orange in color. Sepals, which ensures protection. So these are the sepals and these are the petals. Then you have stamens, which is the male reproductive organ. So these are the stamens. So these are the male reproductive organs. And then you have carpels, which is the female reproductive organ. So this is the carpel, the female reproductive organ which contains the female gamete or the female sex cell, which is called ovum. And the male gametes or the male sex cells are called pollen grains. So if you take a deep look into the male reproductive structure, that is the stamen, this is how it looks like. So this is, the first one is a dorsal view, the second one is a ventral view, and this is a cross-sectional view. So if you look at it, it basically consists of two lobes, and these two lobes are known as anther. And when you look at its cross-section, you see there are four lobes, and these four lobes are called pollen sacs. And these pollen sacs, they actually contain the pollen grains. So that's the purpose of these four sacs or these four lobes. So that's about the male reproductive organ. Now let's talk about the female reproductive organ, that is carpel. So in carpel, you have again a tube-like structure which is called the style. So this is the style, and this top portion is called stigma, and the purpose of this top portion is it receives the male sex cell or the male gamete. So then the male gamete passes through the style, that is the tube-like structure, and then this swollen bottom part is called the ovary. And within the ovary, you have the ovules. So inside this, you basically have the ovules, and the ovules contain the female gamete, which is called ovum. So that's the carpel, that is the female reproductive organ. Now the next question is, how exactly does sexual reproduction occur in plants? So it takes place in 4 steps. The first step is pollination, that is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma. Now why do we need this transfer? That's because for reproduction to take place, the male gamete and the female gamete has to fuse. So for that they need to meet. Now the female gamete is non-mobile. So, but the male gamete can move. So how will the male gamete move? With the help of pollination. So how will the pollen grains, that is the male gamete, get transferred from anther? Anther is part of the male reproductive system, to stigma. Stigma is the part of the female reproductive system. Now there are 2 types of pollination. One is self-pollination, that is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma of the same flower. So in case the flower is a bisexual flower, so the flower will have both the male part and the female part. So in case of bisexual flower, self-pollination is possible. The other type of pollination is cross-pollination, where the transfer of pollen grains takes place from anther of a flower to stigma of a different flower in a different plant. So that's cross-pollination. Okay. Now these pollination process is taken, the process happens with the help of pollinating agents, which could be insects, birds, or rats, who actually help who helps by carrying the pollen grains from anther to stigma. Now the next step is fertilization. So in fertilization, there is fusion of the pollen and the egg, and as a result of fertilization, zygote is formed. So what happens is, now this, let's say that this is the female reproductive part. So in the stigma, the pollen grains reach, and then these pollen grains, they form a pollen tube through the style, and that's how they reach the ovary. Once they reach the ovary, inside the ovary you have the ovum. So one of the pollen grains, they combine or fuses with the egg to form the zygote, the other male gamete, because one pollen grain contains 2 male gametes. So one male gamete will fuse with the egg to form zygote. The other male gamete will fuse with the secondary nuclei to form endosperm. Now these are just a recap. I have already discussed these in detail in our detailed video, the link of which is given in the description section. So in case you want a detailed explanation, you can always refer that video. So the next step was fertilization. Now what happens after fertilization? So then is seed formation. Now, the zygote that is formed, it divides repeatedly to form an embryo. Now, by this time, the ovule develops a thick coat and forms the seed, and the ovary ripens to form a fruit. So, basically, you would have seen that the fruits also appear in plants, and fruit is a result of post-reproduction. So after fertilization has taken place, after that the formation of fruit and the seed takes place. And then how will that seed help? That is germination, that is development of a seedling from a seed. So from a seed you can give rise to a new plant altogether. So if you look at the structure of a seed, it has a small radicle which grows to form the roots, and it has a small plumule which grows to form the shoot, and that's how a new plant arises. So you see, these are the 4 steps which take place for the entire process of sexual reproduction to take place in plants. So here you can see, from a seed arises the roots and the shoots, and finally a plant. So now let's talk about the human reproductive system. So there we will first talk about the male reproductive system. So if we have to talk about the structure, these are the important parts of the human male reproductive system. So we have the testis, which occurs in pairs. Their job is to produce sperms, and they produce the male hormone, which is testosterone. This is the male reproductive hormone. So these are the testes. So you have a pair of testes. Then is the scrotum, whose job is to protect the testis. So if you look at this covering of the testis, that is scrotum, and its job is to maintain a temperature lower than the body temperature, because sperms are produced only at a lower temperature, and that's why we have the testis placed within the scrotum, which is outside the body. And then is the epididymis, which is a complex tube-like structure in the scrotum. So if you see here, you have this complex tube-like structure, that's epididymis. Then is vas deferens, which is again a tube-like structure emerging from lower part of epididymis, and it opens to the ejaculatory duct. So this tube is the vas deferens. And then you have the next one is penis. So penis is this portion, which is a muscular copulatory organ, and it discharges sperms when stimulated. So this portion is the penis. And then finally urethra, which is a tube-like structure, and it is a common passage for both sperms and urines. So this one is urethra, so the thin tube-like structure that you see here. Now here there are a couple of glands also as part of the human reproductive system in males, and these glands are, so some of the important reproductive glands are the prostate gland, seminal vesicles, and Cowper's glands. And as we know that most of them, they secrete some fluid which helps in sperm mobility. Okay, so that was about the male reproductive system. Now the question arises, how exactly the sperms are produced? So we know that they are produced in the testis. Now from the testis they move to the epididymis, which is the coiled tube. From there it moves into the vas deferens, from there seminal vesicle, then ejaculatory duct, and finally to the prostate, and then urethra. Urethra is the thin tube with the opening. So this is how the movement takes place. So if you see here, from this testis to epididymis, and then to the vas deferens, and then to the seminal vesicle, then ejaculatory duct, prostate, and finally through the urethra it is ejaculated. Okay, now in a similar way we will also quickly discuss about the human female reproductive system, where we have a pair of ovaries. So these are the places where the eggs are produced or the ova are produced. Then we have the fallopian tube. So these are the fallopian tubes. So they basically connect the ovary with the uterus. So uterus is that structure which holds the baby for 9 months. So the fetus develops here. So this is uterus. And then the cervix. So this opening is the cervix. It is like the narrow part or the lower part of the uterus. And finally vagina, which is this opening through which the sperm enters inside the female reproductive system. Now the question is, how are the female sex cells produced? So the ova are produced by the epithelium in the ovary. So ova production happens within the ovary, and it's quite a surprising fact that when a female child is within the mother's womb, that time itself the formation of eggs take place. So almost 2 to 3 lakhs of eggs are produced within the ovary of that female fetus. Now as the female attains her puberty, that time these eggs, they start getting matured, and every month an egg mature and the egg gets released, which is called ovulation. Okay, so that's how this entire process of female sex cells production take place, and every month when the egg is released from the ovary, that process is called ovulation. And what is fertilization? As we know, when the fertilization takes place in the fallopian tube, now the sperm enters from this side, so it reaches till the fallopian tube, and the ovum, which is released from the ovary, it also comes to the fallopian tube, and then both of them has to fuse in the fallopian tube. So that's how fertilization takes place. Okay. So as a result of fertilization, a single celled structure called zygote is formed, and then the zygote undergoes repeated division, and gradually it forms the embryo, and meanwhile it also implants itself in the uterus, and then the further development of the child takes place in the uterus till 9 months. Now you should also know about how the embryo receives the nutrition. So there placenta plays a critical role. So it is like a link between the mother and the fetus. So through the placenta, all the food that the mother eats, the nutrients goes to the fetus. Similarly, the water goes to the fetus, and the waste product from the fetus is also excreted out. So placenta acts like that structure between the mother and the fetus. Okay, so next is the question, what happens if the egg doesn't get fertilized? So now an egg is released every month, right, during ovulation, and this egg is alive for 24 hours. So basically it waits for a sperm to come and fertilize it for 24 hours, and meanwhile the uterus prepares itself to receive the fetus, because if fertilization takes place, then the small fetus is going to come and sit in the uterus. So the endometrium, that is the lining of the uterus, this thickens up. However, if there is no fertilization, in that case, this thickening, then no zygote is formed, so no fetus comes here. So this will wait for another maybe 14 days, and finally this endometrium breaks. Now what happens when the endometrium breaks? This blood which had formed this endometrium wall, blood gets released, and this release of blood is known as menstruation, which is also called the sexual cycle in female. So this is the menstrual cycle which occurs every month, that is every 28 days, and the bleeding lasts for 2 to 6 days. Now the start of this process of menstruation is known as menarche, and the stop of this menstruation is known as menopause. So normally menopause takes place at around the age of 45 to 50 years, when this menstruation process or ovulation process, all of these processes stop. So that is called menopause. Now, when we talk about the now many a times you get questions from the contraception methods, that what are the ways to avoid pregnancy. So avoiding pregnancy is what we call as contraception. Now different ways are like use of condoms, which are balloon like elastic covering that tightly fits over the penis, so that whatever sperms are released, they are confined within the condoms and they cannot enter the female reproductive system. So that's one way to avoid pregnancy. Besides that, one can take oral contraceptive pills. Now these medicines do not allow ovulation to take place. Now when ovulation doesn't take place, the egg is not released and therefore fusion cannot take place. Another way could be surgical method like vasectomy, where a small portion of the vas deferens is cut. So a small part of the tube itself is cut. So what will happen? The sperms will not get released. Similarly, there could be a surgical method in the female body which is called tubectomy, where a small portion of the fallopian tube is removed. Now when the tube is removed, the eggs will never be able to meet the sperms, because the sperms need to reach the tube, the eggs need to reach the tube, and the fusion has to happen in the tube. Now if the tube itself is cut, so the process will never take place. Sexually transmitted diseases, those diseases which are transferred from one person to another due to sexual contact. For example, gonorrhea, syphilis, HIV/AIDS, genital and anal warts. So these are some of the sexually transmitted diseases. So you should know about their causes and how can you prevent these diseases, or what are the precautions that can be taken to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. So these were some of the important topics of how do organisms reproduce. Now let's move on to the next lesson, which is heredity and evolution. So in this lesson, we are going to quickly discuss Mendel's experiment, autosomes versus sex chromosomes, homologous and heterologous chromosomes, principles of inheritance, sex determination, evolution, mechanisms of evolution, acquired and inherited traits, speciation, evidences of evolution, and artificial selection versus natural selection. So let's get started with Mendel's experiment. So as we all know that Mendel is the father of genetics and he performed some very famous experiments. So his first experiment was one in which he cross-pollinated tall plants with dwarf plants. So these were the tall plants with genotype T, and these were the dwarf plants with genotype t. And what did he get? So the result of this cross-pollination was all tall plants. So he found that all the plants in this generation, which is called the first filial generation or F1 generation, he found that all the plants were tall and the genotype was like this, T small t. So basically in this case they were homozygous tall and homozygous dwarf, and here they were heterozygous tall. Right, so he observed that both parents contribute to the traits that are seen in the child. Now, to continue this experiment further, what he did was he self-pollinated these heterozygous tall plants. So basically, this was T small t, this was T small t, and he self-pollinated these two heterozygous tall plants. And to his surprise, the result was that 75% of the plants were tall and 25% of the plants were dwarf. So the tall plants were somewhat like this: capital T, capital T, capital T, small t, capital T, small t, and this was small t, small t. So he found that out of all the four varieties that he observed, 50% were heterozygous tall. So these were heterozygous tall. 25% was homozygous tall and 25% was homozygous dwarf. So basically his observation was that there were two traits for the plant height. One was tall, the other one was dwarf. So the dwarf trait was hidden in the F1 generation, but it got expressed in the F2 generation. So this was F2 generation, that is second filial generation. So he found out that there were two copies of the trait which got inherited. One trait was hidden in the first generation, but it again got expressed in the second generation. So this was Mendel's first experiment. So from this he observed that there are two types of trait. One trait which is dominant trait that gets expressed in the offspring, in the new organisms, and it always dominates over the other inherited trait, like how the tall trait did here. So in this case, the tall trait was a dominant trait. So whenever the tall trait was present with the dwarf trait, the tall trait dominated, and as a result the plant was tall. Right? So the dwarf trait, that is the other trait, is what we call as, like in this case, in the first set of experiment, he found that when he crossed these two, all the plants were tall. Why they were tall? Because the tall trait and the dwarf trait both were present and the tall trait was dominant. So they were all tall. However, there was another trait that remains hidden sometimes, being dominated by the dominant trait, and that is called the recessive trait. So in this case, the dwarf trait was the recessive trait, which was hidden in the first generation. However, it got expressed in the second generation. So in the second generation, when we self-pollinated the heterozygous tall plants, we found that we got back the dwarf trait. So this type of trait which remains hidden for some generation but later gets expressed are called recessive trait. Now some of the examples of dominant and recessive traits are, for example, if you talk about the eye color, black eye color or brown eye color, they are dominant trait, but blue eye color is a recessive trait. Similarly, if you talk about the earlobes, so free earlobe pattern is a dominant trait, but attached lobe pattern is a recessive trait. So in this fashion, you have plenty of examples of both dominant and recessive traits, right? So these are some examples as I was discussing. Now, the second set of Mendel's experiment was the dihybrid cross. So in this case, Mendel considered two different traits. One was the color of the seed and the other one was the shape of the seeds. So he cross-pollinated homozygous round and yellow seeds with homozygous wrinkled and green seeds. So you see the color of the seeds, whether it is yellow or green, the shape of the seeds, whether it is round or wrinkled. So he cross-pollinated them. So this was round and yellow seeds. That is capital R, capital R, capital Y, and this was wrinkled and green seeds. Now when they were cross-pollinated, it was found that in the F1 generation, all the seeds were yellow in color and round in shape. So they were basically capital R, capital Y, small y. So here again the dominant traits, that is the round shape and the yellow color, would dominate, and therefore the seed was round and yellow in color. So this was the F1 generation. Now when the F1 generation was self-pollinated, just like the previous experiment, then what happened? So basically somewhat like this. So when capital R, capital Y, small y was self-pollinated like this. So in this case, it was observed that there were 9 round and yellow seeds like this. So basically what happened in this case was, so from this various gametes were formed. For example, I'll just show it to you here. So basically from this one, the various gametes that were formed were capital R, capital Y, capital R, small y, small r, capital Y, small r, small y. Similarly in this side as well. And now then these combined with each other, like this capital R capital Y combined with this, again this combined with this, and so on. So you get huge number of combinations. So basically all that you found was capital R capital Y, capital R capital Y. Similarly here capital R capital Y, capital R small y, and so on. So basically you found that there were 9 seeds which were round and yellow. There were 3 seeds which were green in color but round in shape. There were 3 seeds again which were wrinkled in shape but yellow in color. And there was 1 seed which was green in color and wrinkled in shape. So basically there were 4 varieties which were observed, and these 4 varieties were seen to be present in the ratio of 9:3:3:1. So this is what we call as the dihybrid cross ratio. Now in case you really want to understand how exactly this combination happened, so we have discussed that in our detailed video, the link of which is given in the description section. So now based on these experiments, there were 3 principles of inheritance which were given. The first was principle of dominance, which stated that in a heterozygous organisms, only one of the 2 alleles expresses itself, that is the dominant trait, the other one remains hidden, which is the recessive trait. The second principle was the principle of segregation, which stated that each allele retains its distinct identity even though they remain together in an individual. They segregate only during gamete formation. For example, when capital T small t is crossed with capital T small t, during gamete formation, the alleles segregate separately. So they, even though they stay together, but they have their own identity. So during gamete formation, they segregate like this, and then again they combine independently with another allele. And then the third principle, which is principle of independent assortment, which states that during gamete formation, segregation of alleles of one pair is independent of the segregation of alleles of the other pair. Like as I said, in this case, for this particular capital T small t, this is how the gametes segregated, and this is independent of how the gamete segregation will happen for this another pair of alleles. So they are like independent. So these gametes assort independently. So these are the 3 principles of inheritance. Now let's talk about autosomes and sex chromosomes, because many a times you get questions from these. Now there are 2 sorts of chromosomes. Now when we talk about human beings have a total of 46 chromosomes. So that is 23 pairs of chromosomes. So out of that you have 2 categories. One is autosomes, which are not the sex chromosomes. So they are basically responsible for all the somatic traits. Now, what do we mean by somatic traits? The traits of the body, for example, height, eye color, hair color, ear shape, etc. So they are all somatic traits. So these autosomes, they control somatic traits and they have nothing to do with the sex chromosomes. Now in humans, we have 22 pairs of autosomes. So basically out of these 23 total pair of chromosomes, 22 pairs are autosomes and 1 pair is sex chromosome. So when we talk about the sex chromosome, they determine sex. Whether a person is a male or female, that is determined by the sex chromosomes. So in humans, 1 pair of sex chromosome exists. So if you see here, these are all the autosomes. All the 22 pairs are the autosomes, and this last pair is the sex chromosome. And sex chromosome in case of a male is XY, and in case of a female, it is XX. So based on the knowledge on chromosomes, you should be able to understand how sex determination take place. How do you know whether the baby would be a boy or a girl? Now females have XX as sex chromosome, males have XY as sex chromosome. So if you see here, females have XX, both are identical. Males have XY, which are not identical. Now during fertilization, now when the sperms fuse with the ovum, there are 2 possibilities. Now the female will always give X because the females have both X. So females can only give X. But the sperm can either give X or it can give Y. So if the sperm gives X, then the resultant will be XX. And if the sperm gives a Y, then the resultant would be XY. So if the sperm contributes X, in that case, the baby would be a baby girl. And if the sperm contributes a Y, in that case, the baby would be a baby boy. So basically, the sex of a child is always determined by the father and not by the mother. Okay, so that was all about heredity. Now moving ahead with evolution. So what's evolution? Now from evolution you often get theoretical or conceptual questions more. So evolution is basically the change in inherited characteristics over successive generations. Like in every generation you might see some minor change, but over a long period of time you would see a very new change, and you would actually see new species evolving because of those changes. So that is evolution, and it is a very gradual process. It is also a continuous process. Now the best example to explain evolution is the Darwin's fringes. So once upon a time there was this Galapagos island in Pacific where these seed-eating birds had reached these islands because of storm. It happened years ago. Okay, now here in this island the climate was good, there were no predators, therefore these seed-eating birds reproduced very fast. So there was fast reproduction, and as a result their number increased very fast. Now when their number increased so much, there was scarcity of food, so they were not getting enough food. Now due to genetic variation, it was seen that there were some of these seed-eating birds which had a longer beak when compared to the others. Like normally the seed-eating birds had short beaks, but some of these birds had longer beak. Now these long-beaked birds started eating worms, like small animals like things. So they started eating the worms instead of the seeds, whereas the short-beaked birds, they continued to eat seeds. So basically this long beak gave a survival advantage. So as a result, these birds, they divided themselves into two groups. One was the seed eating, the other one was the worm eating, right? And as a result, this helped them for their survival. And then what happened was, gradually with period of time, it was seen that with these kind of small changes in the birds, which helped in their survival, which acted as a survival advantage to them, there were different types of flinches which gradually arose over a period of time. Right? So currently if you see, there are 13 to 15 species of flinches that exist in that same island. So this is an example of evolution. Now if you talk about the mechanisms of evolution, so there are four mechanisms. First is mutation, that is a change in the DNA sequence. So whenever there is a small change in the DNA sequence, that can cause variation, and this variation can cause mutation, and mutation can lead to evolution. Similarly, the next mechanism could be natural selection, that is a property which which is supported by nature, maybe change in frequency of some genes in a population which gives survival advantage. So the nature gives advantage to that particular feature, and that is why that feature stays, like the evolution of finches with larger beaks. Some of the finches had large beaks, but then nature supported that because that larger beaks helped them to survive better, and that's how it helped in their evolution. Genetic drift, that is change in frequency of some lucky genes in a population, even though these do not give any survival advantage. So just by accident or just by luckily, some of the genes frequency suddenly increase in a population. So that is called genetic drift. And finally, migration, that is movement of organisms suddenly from one place to another, that is migration, and that can also cause evolution. So I had talked about a beetle story, the blue beetles, green beetles, red beetles in my detailed video. So I think that is a very interesting example to understand the mechanisms of evolution, and you must see that. So that shows that how evolution happens. Like here I'll briefly tell you. So there in this area you earlier had all the red beetles, right? Now due to mutation, what happened was suddenly a single beetle of another color was seen, but then that single color also reproduced, and as a result their number increased over a period of time. So that's an example of mutation. Similarly, sometimes what happens is due to accidental incidences, some frequency some population increases, some decreases, and that results in evolution. So I think you should definitely refer the detailed video for this understanding. Okay, then you must know about the acquired and inherited traits. So certain traits that we acquire during our lifetime, for example, skin color. So when we sit in the sun for a long time, it gets tanned, so the skin color changes. So that's an acquired trait. If you cut the tail of a mouse, so that's an acquired trait. Whereas if you talk about inherited traits, that gets passed on from one generation to another. It could be the natural skin color, the hair color, the eye color. So these are all inherited traits. Speciation, many a times you are asked what is it? It is nothing but origin of new species from an existing species, and evolution leads to speciation. Now when you have small changes in an organism over a long period of time, those small changes sum up together to be a big change. In fact, sometimes it gives rise to a new species altogether. So that's speciation. Now, there are certain evidences of evolution, and you get questions from this like morphology and anatomy, fossils, and especially about homologous organs and analogous organs. Homologous means common origin and structure but different functions. For example, if you look at the foliums of amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, they all have different functions. Some of them help in flight, some of them help them to walk, some of them help them to swim, but they all have a common structure and origin. Whereas if you talk about analogous organs, they have different origin and structure, but they perform a similar function. For example, the wings of the bat, wings of a bird, and wings of an insect. So structurally they are so much different from each other, but functionally they are all the same. All of them help in flight. So this is a very important topic from exam perspective. So I think you should definitely focus on this. Besides that, comparative embryology is also an evidence where if you compare the embryo of all the organisms, you would see that at the very early stage, they show similarity. Similarly, evidences from fossils. So I think fossils are an interesting example, that is remains of living organisms from past, and looking at the fossil layers, like the older the organism, the bottommost its layer would be. So by looking at the depth where you find the fossils, you can estimate their age, and by analyzing the structure of the fossils, you can actually see relationship between the different species that existed in the past. For example, fossil records showed that there is a link between birds and reptiles. So, all these things are evidences for evolution. So this is a quick recap. So I'm just trying to give you a hint on these topics, which are more important from your exam perspective. So I think, yes, that was all for heredity and evolution. So let's move on to the next lesson, which is our environment. Now, this is a very specific topic. It is very important from exams perspective. At the same time, you just need to focus on few specific topics like ecosystem, food chain, biological magnification, food web, ozone layer, biodegradable versus non-biodegradable wastes. So let's do a quick recap. So what is ecosystem? So ecosystem is interaction between living organisms in an area along with the non-living constituents of that area. So the living plus non-living of that particular environment together form an ecosystem. For example, pond is an ecosystem, forest is an ecosystem, ocean again is an ecosystem. Now you can have both natural ecosystem as well as artificial ecosystem. So each of these is an example of natural ecosystem. Whereas you can have artificial ecosystem, that is man-made ecosystem. For example, zoo, aquarium, these are all examples of man-made ecosystem. Now, in any ecosystem, you have two types of components. Biotic components, that is the living components of the ecosystem. All the living organisms, whether it is animal, insects, birds, human beings, they are all biotic components. And the abiotic components, that is the non-living components. Non-living components would include soil, water, air, without which the living components cannot survive. So these biotic components and abiotic components together make the ecosystem. Now, if you talk about the biotic components of the ecosystem specifically, you would see that all the living organisms in an ecosystem, they are classified into three groups: producers, consumers, and decomposers. So producers are the ones who prepare food. So they are dependent on themselves for food. In fact, all other organisms also depend on them for food. So examples of producers would be green plants which prepare their food by the process of photosynthesis. Next section is consumer, which depends on the green plants for their food. So consumers depend on producers for their food. And third category is decomposers, which feed on dead and decaying matter. Like when any living organism dies, whether it is plant or animal dead waste, so the decomposers feed on them, and that's how they survive. Now in the consumers, we have few more category like herbivores, which feed only on plants. For example, cow, goat, they are all examples of herbivores. Carnivores are those which feed on flesh. That means they feed on herbivores. For example, lion, tiger. Omnivores are those which feed on both plants as well as flesh. For example, human beings, they eat both plant products as well as animals. And then you have parasites, which live inside the body of another organism and derive its food from them. For example, there are so many bacteria which lives inside our body and they derive their food from our body. So they are examples of parasites. So these are all categories of organisms which fall under the category of consumers. So basically what we understand is within the consumers category, we have different levels of consumers. Like we have the producers, which are the green plants. Then we have the primary consumers, which are nothing but the herbivores, which feed on green plants. Then we have the secondary consumers, which are the carnivores. That is those who feed on the herbivores. For example, frogs. Then the tertiary consumer, that is the organisms which feed on secondary consumers. They are also carnivores. For example, snake. Quaternary consumer, which feeds on the tertiary consumer. They are again carnivores, and examples is hawk. Now in carnivores, you can have many categories. So basically, if you look at this picture, you can see that the green plants are the producers because they produce their own food. They are eaten up by grasshopper, which is a herbivore, that is a primary consumer. This is eaten up by a frog. So frog is a carnivore, but the chain doesn't stop there because the frog again is eaten by another organism, that is snake. The snake again is eaten by a hawk. So all of these, hawk, frog, snake, they all fall under carnivore, but their level as a consumer is increasing. So one is a secondary consumer, the next one is a tertiary consumer, the next one is a quaternary consumer, and so on. So in this fashion, you see that there is a chain which is forming based on the food habits of different organisms. And then finally, you have the decomposers, which feed on the dead organisms like the bacteria and fungi. They are examples of the decomposers. So now this chain is what we call as the food chain, that is series of living organisms feeding on one another. Now each level of a food chain is called a trophic level. So in this case, grass, which is eaten by a deer, which in turn is eaten by the lion or the tiger. So this is like the producer, this is the herbivore, this is the carnivore, or you can say this is the producer, this is primary consumer, this is secondary consumer, or you can say that this is the first trophic level, second trophic level, third trophic level. So this entire chain is called a food chain. Now a food chain can have 2 steps like this. A food chain can have 3 steps like this, or it can have 4 steps or even 5 steps. So a food chain can have more number of steps if you have more organisms like which are feeding on one another. So like that, you can have a multi-step food chain as well. And when you talk about the flow of energy in a food chain, you should always remember that the producers which prepare food in presence of sunlight, so they during their food preparation, only 1% of the solar energy is converted to food. Now, when these producers give food to the primary consumer, then only 10% of the producer's energy goes into the primary consumer's body. Again, when the secondary consumer feeds on the primary consumer, only 10% of the primary consumer's energy gets into the secondary consumer's body, and so on as we move higher the level. So this is what is known as the Lindermans Law, which states that it is also called Lindermans 10% law, which states that only 10% of the food energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next higher trophic level. Next is biomagnification. What is it? Magnification means magnify, to increase. Now it states that there is increase in concentration of a toxic substance as it goes higher up in the food chain. Now in any food chain, if a toxic substance enters, this could be a toxic chemical or any poison, now its concentration level would increase as it goes higher in the food chain. The higher the trophic level, the higher is the concentration of the chemicals. For example, let's say that this water is contaminated with some harmful chemicals. Now when this water is taken up by these phytoplanktons, these small organisms living in the water, so some concentration of these chemicals get inside their body, but when these small organisms are eaten up by the fishes, the level or the concentration of the chemicals inside the body of the fishes is a lot more than that of these small organisms. Now when these fishes in turn are eaten up by bigger fish, and then the level of the concentration of chemicals is highest in the biggest fish. So the biggest fish is at the highest trophic level, and therefore the concentration of chemicals is also highest in the big fish. So that's how, as the trophic level increases, the concentration of the chemicals also increases. That is called biomagnification or biological magnification. Ozone layer is another important topic from where you get a variety of questions. You can be asked, what is ozone layer? Why is it important to us? What can happen due to depletion of ozone layer? How can we stop ozone layer depletion? So you can have all these variety of questions. So I'll quickly recap through it. So ozone layer is a protective layer around the earth. Its function is to absorb the harmful ultraviolet radiation of the sun, which can otherwise cause huge number of diseases in our body, for example, skin cancer. Now, decrease in the amount of ozone is causing the depletion of the ozone layer. So obviously, since ozone layer is serving a purpose, it is absorbing the harmful ultraviolet radiation. If the ozone layer is not there, then we will be exposed to the harmful radiation. We will definitely not want that. So what is the cause of the depletion? Use of chlorofluorocarbons. So that's the main cause of ozone layer depletion. And what are the bad consequences or harmful effects of ozone layer depletion? It can cause several diseases like skin cancer, leukemia and breast cancer. It can damage the immune system. It can damage plants. So these are the adverse effects of ozone layer depletion. Now, the last topic for this chapter is biodegradable and non-biodegradable waste. It's a very simple topic, but sometimes you are asked to categorize some substances into biodegradable or non-biodegradable. So, biodegradable, something that can be degraded or that can be broken down into simpler and harmless form. That is biodegradable. So, obviously, anything that can be broken down into harmless forms is always good. And something which cannot be degraded into simpler and harmless form, that is non-biodegradable. So examples of biodegradable wastes could be all those substances like paper waste, agricultural waste, cow dung, excreta, because they can be decomposed by microorganisms like bacteria or fungi. And that's how they do not damage the environment. Whereas non-biodegradable wastes, their decomposition is very, very slow, or you can say almost no decomposition. As a result, they get accumulated in the environment and they pollute the environment. For example, plastics, pesticides, insecticides, DDT, industrial wastes. And that is why these days there is a lot of awareness that we should not use plastics a lot. We should try to use less plastics. In fact, these days we also get biodegradable plastics which can be recycled to be used in some other way. So that is why all of these happen, so that we can protect our environment. So these were some of the important topics on our environment, and if you can cover these topics, I think you can do good in your exams. Moving on to the next lesson, which is life processes. So in this lesson, we are briefly going to cover these topics like life processes, human digestive system, nutrition in plants, respiratory system in humans, respiration in plants, human circulatory system, transport in plants, excretion in plants, and human excretory system. Now, if you talk about the board exams, sometimes you do not get much questions from life processes, but sometimes you do get certain questions from this chapter, because this chapter as such is a very basic chapter of biology, because it tells you about all the different systems of our bodies. So that means it is a very important concept of biology, but from exam perspective, you never know. Sometimes you do get questions, sometimes you do not. But it is always good that you are thorough with the functioning of all of these systems, so that in case you get a question, you will be able to answer. So let's start with the different life processes. Now, as we know, nutrition, that is intake of food. We all need food for energy. Respiration, how do we actually convert that food into energy? That is respiration. Transportation, now once you convert it into energy, how that gets transported to all parts of the body? So that's transportation. The excretion, what about the unwanted substances within the body? We want to get rid of them. So that's excretion. And then control and coordination. Now all the actions that we do, like we see a particular let's say we see an ice cream and we feel like having it, so how is that coordinated? Like what we see and what we feel, how is that coordinated? So that is what we will study in control and coordination. Reproduction, how do organisms reproduce and give birth to more organisms of its kind? So that's reproduction. Growth and development, now once organisms reproduce, they give birth to little ones, and how do they grow and develop to form mature organisms? So that is all about growth and development. And finally, movement, how do organisms move from one place to another? So these are the various life processes. So in this lesson we will cover nutrition, respiration, transportation and excretion. So let's get started with nutrition. So we are going to cover holozoic nutrition, which is intake of solid food. Now holozoic nutrition takes place in 5 steps. That is ingestion, which is intake of food. Then digestion, that is conversion of complex food into simpler forms. Like let's say you have a sandwich. So the sandwich needs to be broken down into a very simpler form so that it can be absorbed by the body. So that's digestion. Then you have absorption, that is the digested food must be absorbed by the body. And then assimilation, now the absorbed food should be utilized for energy. And finally egestion, that is the undigested portion of the food should be removed from the body. So that's egestion. So these are the 5 steps in holozoic nutrition. Now nutrition takes place in different organisms in different ways. So if you talk about the unicellular amoeba, which is made up of just one cell, so there also it has holozoic nutrition where ingestion happens through pseudopodia, which is the false feet, and this ingestion of amoeba is given a special term called phagocytosis. So if you look at this picture, let's say this is a food particle. So this is how the amoeba intakes the food or takes in the food. So once the food is taken in, then happens digestion with the help of enzymes which are released by the food vacuole. Then absorption, digested food diffuses into the cytoplasm of amoeba. Then assimilation, where the absorbed food is stored and utilized later for synthesis. And finally egestion, that is the undigested food is expelled out through the cell membrane. So you see, even for a simple organism like amoeba, which has just one cell, this also performs holozoic nutrition including all the 5 steps. Now, in a similar way, in human beings also we have holozoic nutrition and we have a specific digestive system. So when we talk about the human digestive system, these are some of the important parts of the digestive system. So the first one is mouth, which helps us in the intake of food, like it helps in ingestion. Then is the buccal cavity, which is also called the oral cavity or the mouth cavity, where we have teeth, saliva and tongue. So teeth helps us to crush food into pieces. Saliva, it makes the food soft because saliva is the watery fluid that is present inside our mouth. So it makes the food softer, so that helps us to break it down further into pieces. Besides that, saliva also contains the enzyme salivary amylase, which converts starch into sugar. So starch is like the complex food form. And then the tongue, movement of the tongue helps us in movement of the food towards the pharynx or the food pipe. And besides that, tongue also helps us to taste the food. Then is pharynx, which is a common passage for food and air. As you see here, this portion is the pharynx, okay? And then it also connects to the food pipe and the wind-pipe. So basically from the pharynx, there are 2 parts. If it is food, then it goes to the food pipe. If it is air coming through nostrils, then it goes to the wind-pipe. As you can see here, this is the food pipe, this thing. And this one is the wind-pipe, the sky blue color one. Okay, and then esophagus. So esophagus is the food pipe. As you see here, this is the food pipe and it helps in downward movement of the food. So till now digestion has not taken place much. So now when the food reaches the stomach, so this is stomach, so the digestion happens here. So the stomach has muscular walls, so otherwise it is small, but when food reaches the stomach it increases in size. Now stomach contains certain gastric glands which secrete enzymes like pepsin and hydrochloric acid, mucus. So all of these help in digestion of the food. So basically acidic environment is needed for these enzymes to do their action. So for that hydrochloric acid helps. Now digestion happens with the help of these gastric enzymes in stomach, and then here the food also gets some secretions coming from the liver. So liver is like a gland. It is the largest gland in the body, and it secretes bile juice which is stored in the gallbladder. So this is the liver and this is the gallbladder. The green structure is the gallbladder. So its purpose is to emulsify fats. It also makes the medium alkaline and activates the action of pancreatic and intestinal enzymes. So other enzymes which are secreted by pancreas or the intestine. So to make those enzymes active, it makes the medium alkaline. So that's the significance of the bile juice. Besides that, you have the second largest gland of the body, which is pancreas, which secretes pancreatic juice. This contains enzymes like trypsin, which digest proteins, pancreatic amylase, which digests starch, and pancreatic lipase, which digests fats. So you see, gradually all the complex substances like protein, starch or fats, they are broken down into their simpler forms, maybe amino acids, sugars and fatty acids. And then finally the food reaches into the small intestine where the remaining digestion takes place. So partly digestion had already taken place in the stomach. The remaining digestion will take place in small intestine. Small intestine structurally has three parts: duodenum, jejunum and ileum. So as you can see here, this is ileum. So this coiled structure, that is the small intestine. So it has these three parts. And then, so the first part is the duodenum. So this is the first part. So you see, from here the small intestine starts. So that is duodenum, then you have jejunum, and then you have ileum. So here the pancreatic enzymes along with the bile juice helps in digestion. Intestinal glands also secrete enzymes to digest carbohydrates, proteins and fats. Now the digestion process gets completed in the small intestine. In fact, absorption also happens here. So here we have small hair-like structure called villi, which are richly supplied with blood vessels. So these blood vessels helps in the absorption of the food items, like the simpler food forms. And finally the undigested food is passed into the large intestine. So you see this green colored structure. So all the excess water is absorbed from the food undigested part, and the remaining and then the undigested part is thrown out through anus. So basically egestion happens in large intestine. So this is how the entire human digestive system works. Now let's move on to nutrition in plants. So as we know that plants are autotrophs, they can prepare their own food in presence of sunlight by a process called photosynthesis. So what exactly happens in photosynthesis? So some of the prerequisites for photosynthesis to take place are chlorophyll, sunlight, carbon dioxide and water. So in photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water, they combine together in presence of chlorophyll and sunlight. So they form food in the form of C6H12O6 plus water is released plus oxygen is released. So if you balance this equation, this would be 6, this would be 12, this would be 6 and this would be 6. So this is the entire thing that happens in photosynthesis. So you can see exchange of gases take place. So carbon dioxide is taken in and oxygen is given out. So how does exchange of gases take place? So they take place through tiny pores on the leaves of the plants, which are called stomata. And how do they get water? From where do they get water? So water is taken up from the soil. The plants take water from the soil, and the food that is prepared in the form of starch, which is stored in the plants and is used up as and when required. So that's the process of photosynthesis. So if you look at the steps of photosynthesis, you would see that chlorophyll plays a very critical role. Now, chlorophyll has the property that it can absorb light energy. That's why the process takes place in presence of sunlight. And then the light energy is converted into chemical energy, and the water molecules are split into into hydrogen and oxygen, and on the other side the carbon dioxide is reduced to carbohydrates, as you can see in this equation for photosynthesis. So let us now move ahead and talk about the next life process, that is respiration. So respiration is all about how do we generate energy from the absorbed food. So basically it is oxidation of assimilated molecules to release their bond energy. So in respiration what happens is, so this is like the simplest food form in the form of glucose. So when this is oxidized, it gives carbon dioxide plus water plus a lot of energy. And in respiration we are interested in this energy, because why do we eat food? So that we get energy to do work. So how do we convert this food into energy? So that happens during respiration. Now, a lot of time we feel that respiration is only about breathing. So breathing and respiration are not the same thing. So when you talk about respiration, it is about exchange of gases, because for respiration to take place, you take in oxygen and you give out carbon dioxide. So it is definitely about exchange of gases, but at the same time it is also about oxidation of food so that we release energy. And how is this energy released? In the form of ATP molecules, that is adenosine triphosphate molecules. The more number of ATP molecules are just like energy currencies. So the more number of ATP molecules you generate, the more energy you generate. Now, respiration are of two types: aerobic respiration, which takes place in presence of oxygen, and anaerobic respiration, which occurs in absence of oxygen. So in aerobic respiration, complete oxidation takes place, whereas in anaerobic respiration, incomplete oxidation takes place. So if you look at the net ATP yield, you see that in aerobic respiration 38 ATP molecules are produced, whereas in anaerobic respiration only 2 ATP molecules are produced. So if you look at their exact equations, you would see that in aerobic respiration the end products are carbon dioxide and water, whereas in anaerobic respiration you have ethyl alcohol or lactic acid and carbon dioxide. So aerobic respiration is seen in most plants and animals, whereas anaerobic respiration occurs in some bacteria, worms and human muscle cells during vigorous exercise. That's why you would have seen that if you do some vigorous exercise, after some time your legs start paining, especially just below the thigh portion. That area pains. Why does that happen? Because you are doing too much of work, so your body is not able to generate that much of energy. So anaerobic respiration takes place, because of which this lactic acid, which is which kind of gets accumulated in that portion, and because of that accumulation of lactic acid, you feel that pain during vigorous exercise in the muscle cells. Okay, and in aerobic respiration, a part of it occurs in cytoplasm, rest in mitochondria in the cells, whereas in anaerobic respiration, the entire process takes place in cytoplasm. Now, you should definitely not only know the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration, you should also know the exact steps of both of these respiration. That is important. So, I am not discussing that here in detail, but I have done that in the detailed video. So, please have a look at that video and know the exact steps of aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Okay, so these are the different pathways of glucose breakdown. So glucose gets converted to pyruvate, and then in anaerobic mode, it can get converted to ethanol plus carbon dioxide plus energy, or lactic acid plus energy, or in the aerobic mode, it can get converted to carbon dioxide plus water plus energy. Now, respiration not only takes place in human beings but also in plants. So, how do plants respire? So, in plants, gaseous exchange takes place through the process of diffusion. And what are the gases that are exchanged? Obviously, oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, they happen through either the tiny pores on the leaves, that is stomata, or through the lenticels, like these are the lenticels, or through the surface of the roots. So, these are the three medium through which diffusion can take place in plants. Now, not only plants, but you also see respiration in lot of aquatic animals. Like the aquatic animals, they take the oxygen which is dissolved in water. What is water? Water is H2O. So water also has oxygen in dissolved form. So this oxygen is taken up by the aquatic animal. So if you look at fishes, they have specialized organs called gills for absorption of oxygen. So that's how their body is structured. Now, if you talk about the human respiratory system, we again have a set of organs which together perform this function of respiration. So, it starts with nostrils through which the air is taken in. So, the air that we take in, we basically are interested in oxygen, because we need oxygen for oxidation of food. So in the nostrils we have fine hairs to filter out all the unwanted particles. Then is the nasal cavity, like how you have mouth and then oral cavity, similarly you have nostrils and then nasal cavity. So in the nasal cavity you see that there is a central septum that separates the left and the right air passages. The nasal passages are also lineated with ciliated epithelium and mucus. And then from the nostrils, the air gets warmed and moistened at the nasal cavity, and then it moves down further to the windpipe. So how does it goes to the windpipe? So as I have mentioned before also, you have pharynx here, which is like a common place for food pipe and windpipe. So if it is food which is coming in, it will pass it to the food pipe. If it is wind, then it will pass it to the windpipe. And it is decided by the epiglottis, which is a small flap of skin, and it prevents the food from entering into the respiratory tract. So it ensures that the right thing goes into the right pipe. So as you see here, so this is the food pipe and this one is the windpipe. And if you look at this place, you have the epiglottis here. So when this opens, then it gets into the windpipe. When this closes, then it gets into the food pipe. So epiglottis is like that gate which decides the entry of the substances. Next is trachea, which is the windpipe. So trachea is also, this is the trachea. This is also internally lined by cilia and mucus, and it runs from throat till the thoracic cavity. And then the trachea ends into lungs. Now lungs play a very important role in breathing as well as oxygen absorption. So inside the lung, we see that this trachea, it kind of divides into thinner tubes called bronchi. Like if this is the trachea, it divides into thinner tubes like this, which are called bronchi. This bronchi further divides into tubes which are called bronchioles. So these are the bronchi, then bronchioles, and then the bronchiole again ends in a tiny cluster of air chambers. Like as you see here, these are called alveoli. So it's like you have bronchi, then you have bronchioles, and then at the end of the bronchioles you have like tiny air chambers which are alveoli, and these alveoli provide a surface where the actual exchange of gases take place. So normally we say that exchange of gases take place inside the lungs, but where inside the lungs? At the alveoli. So alveoli, they contain an extensive network of blood vessels, that is capillaries, and that is how gaseous exchange take place. Because as we say that we take in oxygen, we give out carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is like all the used up carbon dioxide from all the cells of the body, they get collected through the blood vessels. Then the exchange takes place at the alveoli, right? So what happens is all the carbon dioxide is given back, the oxygen is taken up. So that exchange takes place at the alveoli, and that's how the process of respiration works. So we can say that alveoli are the functional units of lungs. Okay, so that was about the respiratory system. Now moving ahead, we'll talk about the circulatory system, that how exactly all the useful substances are transported to different parts of the body. Now when we talk about circulatory system in animals, there are two types of circulatory system. One is open circulatory system, the other one is closed circulatory system. So open circulatory system is seen in lower animals where we have the concept of hemolymph. We do not have the concept of blood vessels. So here it is like blood is present all over inside the body, and all the organs are like kind of bathing in blood. So they are like lying in blood. So that's how it is. So the organisms continuously need to move in order to make the blood move inside their body. So that's how the organization is, and it is seen in mollusks and arthropods. Whereas in closed circulatory system, the blood is not lying just like that inside our body. It is enclosed in blood vessels. So we have the arteries, the veins, the capillaries. So they are basically the blood vessels which carry blood. So here the blood is enclosed in areas. And here also the interstitial fluid, like the fluid which is present in between the organs, that is separated from blood, because blood is confined within vessels. They are confined within tubes. So in this case, the blood is pumped by the heart through these blood vessels and doesn't normally fill body cavities. So it is not that all the empty spaces is filled with blood. It is not like that. So blood is flowing through the tubes, and the pumping of the blood happens by this organ called heart. So that's how the organization is, and that is closed circulatory system, and it is seen in all the higher animals. Like vertebrates, invertebrates, human beings, we see closed circulatory system. Now, if you talk about the closed circulatory system in human beings, we have a four-chambered heart. We have two auricles and two ventricles. That is, they are called left auricle, left ventricle, and right ventricle. So, this four-chambered heart, they prevent mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So, oxygenated blood is rich in oxygen and deoxygenated blood is rich in carbon dioxide. So, now you know the difference. So, the body needs oxygen and the body wants to throw out the carbon dioxide. So, we do not want to mix these two, so let them stay separate. So the type of circulation that takes place in human beings is called double circulation, and the high rate of oxygen rich blood flow. So if you look at all the blood vessels, we have the arteries, we have the veins, and we also have the capillaries. So arteries carry the oxygenated blood, veins carry the deoxygenated blood. So you can have a look at how their system is. So arteries, they divide into thinner tube-like structure called arterioles, which further divides into thinner tube-like structures called capillaries. And then again, these capillaries, they join together to form venules, which in turn form veins, and then this forms vena cava. So that is how the blood vessels are organized. So I would advise you to have a look at the detailed video in case you want to understand how exactly it works, because right now I'm just giving you a recap for all of those who have understood this. So this is like a quick recap. And the capillaries have extremely thin walls. Now, knowing all of these blood vessels, the chambers of the heart, it is important that you know the structure of the heart. So the auricles here are the receiving chambers and the ventricles are the pumping chambers. So you remember AIR. So auricles, receiving chambers, VIP, ventricles, pumping chambers. So auricles are separated from the ventricles by coronary sulcus. So if you look at this diagram, this is that portion which separates the auricles from the ventricles. So this is the coronary sulcus. And the left auricle is separated from the right auricle by interauricular septum. Similarly, the left ventricle is separated from the right ventricle by interventricular septum. So this is interventricular septum, this is interauricular septum in between these two, and this portion is the coronary sulcus. Now, in the human heart, there are valves, and these valves have a very critical role to perform. Now, they open one way and control the flow of blood. So, how do we know when the blood should flow from right auricle to right ventricle? When it should flow from left auricle to left ventricle? So, that is all determined by the opening and closing of the valve. So, there are four valves, that is pulmonary valve, which is present between the right ventricle and pulmonary artery. We have the tricuspid valve, the bicuspid or mitral valve, and the aortic valve. So I think we know all of these valves. So basically you should know about all of these valves and when they open and close. You should be clear about all of that. So I think one best way to remember is to remember this diagram. So if you remember the structure, you anyways remember where are these valves located. And then overall the circulation of the heart, I think by now all of you know this, so I will not get into the detail, but yes, this is an important thing. So when you are learning about the circulatory system, you should know from where the blood flows, where it goes, and how it is controlled by the valves. Okay, so that was about the circulatory system. Components of blood is an important topic because you do get small questions from here. So the blood consists of plasma, which is the fluid matrix on which the blood cells are embedded. And the blood cells which are embedded in this matrix are RBCs. These are small cells without nucleus. They carry oxygen from lungs to different parts of the body, and they contain the respiratory pigment called hemoglobin, because of which they have this red color, and that is why they are called red blood cells. Their small size enables them to travel in extremely thin capillaries. So the red blood that flows through our body, that red color is because of these red blood cells or hemoglobin. Then you have the second component, that is WBC or white blood cells. They have nucleus and they help fight infection and builds our immune system. Like our body has its own immune system. So anything goes wrong within the body, any small thing that goes wrong, the immune system fights back and keeps the body or protects the body, you can say. So these are the white blood cells. Now there are many different types of white blood cells again, like neutrophil, eosinophil, basophil, etc. And these white blood cells, they have a very short lifespan. They live for 3 to 4 days in human body. Next is the platelets. They are smaller in size and they help in blood clotting. So whenever you get a cut somewhere, so it starts to bleed, but it doesn't bleed forever, because in that case you will lose all the blood inside your body. It bleeds, but after some time there is a blood clot and the bleeding stops. So blood clotting is very, very important to save your blood, right? Okay. Now let's talk about transport in plants. So there we have the vascular bundles, xylem and phloem, which help in transportation. So xylem helps to transport water and minerals which are absorbed by the roots from the soil. So this phenomenon of upward movement of water and minerals is known as ascent of sap. The other component is phloem, which helps in transportation of food from leaves to other parts of the plant. So xylem is concerned with water and minerals, and phloem is concerned with transportation of food. So phenomenon of transport of food from leaves to other plant parts is called translocation. So phloem is associated with translocation, xylem is associated with ascent of sap. Now let's move on to the next life process, that is excretion. So how are the waste products removed from a plant? So in plants, the food is produced by photosynthesis, but as a result of photosynthesis, oxygen is a waste product, because oxygen is one of the products of photosynthesis which is not required right at that time. So what do we do with that oxygen? Similarly, water is another waste product during transpiration, that is loss of water from the leaves, right? So all of these, they are thrown out of the plants by excretion. Now plants also excrete in the form of raisins or gums, and all of these happens sometimes through the tiny pores on the leaves of the plants, that is stomata. And that process is what we call as transpiration. So whatever waste products are there in the plant, they are all thrown out of the plant from the surface of the plants. Plants also excrete through leaves or bark which fall off later. Like you would have seen, the dried leaves or the dead leaves, they fall off from the plant. So that is also one way of excretion. Now whatever is there in that dried leaf, that is also gone from the plant. So that's another way of getting rid of unwanted things. So this is how excretion happens in plants. Now if you talk about excretion in human beings, we again have an excretory system which is made up of a pair of kidneys. Now if you look at this, the kidneys are located in the abdomen. There are two kidneys, one on either side of the backbone, and they are bean shaped. And from the kidneys you have these tube-like structures which are called ureters. And these ureters connect to the urinary bladder. So this is the place which stores urine. So it is the reservoir of urine. And then finally you have this opening called urethra, from which the urine comes out of your body. So basically urine is that medium which helps you to excrete. So all the waste products from our body, that is there in the urine, urine takes all of that and goes out of our body. So another important thing here is how urine formation takes place, right? So this urine production happens in the kidneys, and then the urine moves through the ureters, goes to the urinary bladder, gets stored in the urinary bladder. When sufficient amount of urine gets stored in the urinary bladder, then it is released through the urethra. Now the question is, how exactly urine is formed in the kidneys? So that process is again an important one. So I think all of you should actually look at the detailed video to understand the detailed process if you have not understood it. And for all of those who have already watched the video and understood it, so it is just like a recap. So we can say that substances like glucose, amino acids, salts, and good amount of water, they are selectively reabsorbed as the urine flows along the tubular part of the nephron. So nephron are like the functional units of kidneys. So if you look at each of these nephrons, they have this coiled tube-like structure where this entire filtration process takes place. And then the amount of water absorbed depends upon the amount of wastes in the body and the amount of excess water in the body, because our body needs to be hydrated. So you just cannot take out all the water from the body. So only the excess amount of water will be taken out, and then all the waste products will be thrown out with that water, and that is what we call as urine. Right, so this is how urine formation takes. Let's move on with the next lesson, that is control and coordination. So in this lesson, we will discuss about endocrine versus exocrine glands, like how are these two types of glands different. Human endocrine system, this is important because you do get a lot of questions from which hormone is secreted by which gland and what are the functions of that hormone. neurons, which is like the basic structure for the nervous system, human brain, trophic and nastic movements in plants. So these are some of the topics from where you tend to get more questions. So let's quickly revise them. First of all, endocrine versus exocrine glands. So endocrine glands secrete chemical substances, that is hormones, that travel through blood to specific target organs of the body. Now these are also called ductless glands, that is they do not have tubes or ducts. For example, pineal gland, thyroid gland, parathyroid gland, pituitary gland, they are all examples of endocrine glands, and all these endocrine glands together form the endocrine system. On the other hand, when you talk about the exocrine glands, these are glands with ducts or tubes. For example, salivary glands, which secrete saliva, sweat glands which secrete sweat, or the oil glands. So these glands secrete chemical substances that travel through tubes to the target organs. So endocrine gland secretion travels through blood, and exocrine gland secretion travel through ducts, that is tubes. Now let's talk about the human endocrine system. So the chemical coordination is in human beings is done by the human endocrine system. All the endocrine glands and the hormones secreted by them, they together form the endocrine system. So these are the various glands which are located in our body. For example, the pineal gland, pituitary gland and hypothalamus. These are the three glands which are located in and around the brain. Then you have the thyroid and the parathyroid gland towards your neck. You have the thymus gland near the thoracic portion, and finally adrenal gland and pancreas, and then you have testis and ovary, testis in males and ovary in female. So now let us look at the secretions of all of these glands. So hypothalamus secretes the releasing hormone, pituitary gland releases growth hormone, trophic hormone, prolactin, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Now please remember that you also need to know the functions of each of these hormones. Pineal gland secretes melatonin, thyroid, thyroxine, parathyroid, parathormone, adrenal, adrenaline and corticoids. Islet of Langerhans of pancreas, it secretes insulin, glucagon. Ovaries secrete estrogen and progesterone, and testes secrete testosterone. So we know that testosterone is responsible for all the male specific reproductive features. Similarly, estrogen and progesterone takes part in the female reproductive system. Insulin, glucagon, they are very important because when the level of insulin varies in our body, that can lead to diseases like diabetes. Similarly, when the growth hormone level goes abnormal, that can cause either dwarfism or it can cause gigantism. Similarly, thyroxine again is very important because it can cause thyroid disorders, that is hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. So let us quickly see why should hormones be present in right amount. As I said, growth hormone very less amount, dwarfism very high amount, gigantism. Similarly, insulin hyposecretion can cause diabetes mellitus, which is like a very threatening disease because it needs a lot of restriction, lot of care for the person. Thyroid hormone plays a critical role because again, too much of it, hyperthyroidism, very less of it, hypothyroidism. So hypothyroidism can cause cretinism, that is retarded physical and mental growth in children. So that's again a very bad disorder. Iodine is needed for thyroxine synthesis. That is why we say that everybody should always consume iodized salt, because you need iodine for synthesis of thyroxine. If your iodine intake is poor, then thyroxine will not get synthesized. So there would be hyposecretion of thyroid, and lack of iodine can cause goiter, like as you see in the picture, that is swelling of neck due to malfunctioning of thyroid gland. Okay, now let's move on to the human nervous system. Structure of neuron. This is very, very important. Many a times you are asked to draw the Lebel diagram of neuron. So neuron basically consists of the cell body. As you can see here, this is the cell body or cyton, which has a well-defined nucleus, and the cytoplasm has Nissel's granules and neurofibrils. Then you have the dendrites. As you see here, these branch-like structures, they are thread-like structures. They receive impulses from outside and pass it on to the cyton. So they receive impulses and then pass it on to cyton. And then we have axon, that is this long thread-like structure is axon. So it has fibrous branches at the ends which are called axon endings, like these are the axon endings or nerve endings. So axon endings of one neuron are loosely placed on cyton of other neurons. So that's how the neurons communicate information. So from the nerve ending of one neuron to the cyton of the other neuron, and again so on. Okay, so that's the structure of neuron. Now, the purpose of axon is to conduct impulses away from the cyton. So basically, the impulses are taken to the axon and then they are thrown out of this neuron. So that's how the information passes. Okay, now in human beings, if you talk about the nervous system, there is a central nervous system which is brain and spinal cord, and there is a peripheral nervous system which consists of the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. It's good to know the structure of brain, like you have the skull, which is a bony structure to protect the brain. It also can be divided into two parts, that is cranium and mandible, and total it is made up of 22 bones, out of which 8 are cranial bones which are part of the cranium, and 14 are facial bones, that is they are part of the face. Then you have meninges, that is 3 layers of protective tissue which cover the brain. Now brain is a very critical thing. It has to function really well for a human being to survive. So it is also important that we protect the brain enough. So you have skull as the outer covering, then you have these 3 layers of tissues to cover the brain once again. So these meninges ensure protection. Then you have the brain ventricles, that is the fluid-filled cavities inside the brain. And then you have the cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid which fills the spaces between meninges and the ventricles. So purpose of the cerebrospinal fluid is protection, buoyancy and excretion. So the fluid, through the fluid you can excrete unwanted materials. Now due to presence of the fluid, it gives a cushion-like feel, that way it again protects it. So these are the various parts of the human brain. Now the brain is also divided into 3 main parts: forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. As you can see, the 3 parts in 3 different colors: yellow, pink and blue. Okay, so now let's talk about the control and coordination in plants. Now in plants, the growth dependent movement of a plant with response to a stimulus is called tropic movement. Now this tropic movement is again an important topic from exam perspective. You do get questions related to tropic movements. Now there are various types of movements like phototropism, geotropism, hydrotropism and chemotropism. So phototropism is the plant movements with response to light. Geotropism is plant movements with response to earth. Hydrotropism with response to water, and chemotropism is with response to chemicals. Now, plant hormones, there are certain naturally occurring plant hormones. You should know their functions. Now, this is again important because you often get questions asked from these plant hormones. So, some of the hormones are auxin, which is produced at shoot tip in presence of light, and it promotes cell division and elongation. So, basically, it helps in growth of the plant. Then you have gibberellins, which again help in stem growth. It results in increase in size of fruit and flower. So specifically also you should know that how is auxin different from gibberellin. Then you have cytokinin, which promotes cell division, delay aging, regulate transport of nutrients. So basically all these hormones, auxin, gibberellin, cytokinin, they all in a way promote plant growth. Whereas when you talk about a hormone like abscisic acid, it inhibits growth. So that's important. So abscisic acid inhibits growth. All of these others, they promote growth. So abscisic acid reverses the effect of auxins and gibberellins. It results in wilting of leaves. So these are the various plant hormones and their functions. Now this is very, very important. So please focus. Okay, now let's move on to the last lesson, that is management of natural resources. So here you just need to focus on a few important things, like you should know what are natural resources. These are things which exist in nature on its own, but they are useful to us, like soil, air, water, forests, wildlife, coal, petroleum, so basically the fossil fuels. So in this, from exam perspective, I think forests and water, they are very important because you often get questions related to dams, like what are the advantages and disadvantages of having dams. You can have questions related to forest, like what is Shipko Andolan, or how can we preserve forest, or how are forests helpful to us. So questions like that. So you should always remember the 3 R's when it comes to natural resources, that is reduce unnecessary usage of natural resources, recycle the same thing in many different ways, reuse, if you can use something over and again, so please do that. So these 3 R's can actually help the environment a lot. So when I talk about forests and wildlife management, when I talk about the forest, it is not just about the animals or birds which live in the forest. It is also about the plants that we have in the forest, because forest is a biodiversity spot. You have huge variety of living organisms there. So if you destroy the forest, you are actually impacting the lives of so many organisms. So loss of diversity may lead to a loss of ecological stability, because as we all know that all these organisms are interdependent. In some or the other way, they are dependent on each other. So when we destroy the ecosystem, so the entire stability is disturbed. Now, Chipko Andolan, this is very important because they have been asked multiple times in the past. So, what was Chipko Andolan? So, in the past, once it so happened that all the village women, they clasped the tree trunks so that the trees cannot be cut down by the workers, because normally what happens is huge areas of forests are cut down just to build industries or factories or things like that. So much of industrialization is also not good, because it has an adverse effect on the environment. So when these ladies, they kind of clasped the tree trunks, so that is why it was called chipko, because they stuck to the trees and prevented them from falling down. So that's why it is called Chipko Andolan. Now, coming to water, it's obviously a basic need. We need water for our survival. So, but these days there is water scarcity because lack of rainfall, too much of lack of vegetation cover, because forests are being cut down. So, that balance is getting disturbed. Diversion for high water demanding crops. So, we are growing more crops which needs more water. So, more water is getting used up there. Pollution from industrial effluents and urban wastes. So a lot of water is also getting wasted because of pollution and because of other unnecessary wastes. So there is a purpose that we have dams. So why do we have dams? So that we can store water for irrigation, because we do not get rainfall throughout the year, but we need water for agriculture. So for that purpose, we store water in dams. So that's the positive side of dams. At the same time, these dams can also help in electricity generation. That is, we can harness the energy of flowing water and convert it into electricity. So that's a very nice way of utilizing the dams. But at the same time, when we have too much dams being constructed here and there are also problems with dams. Like, there is no equal distribution of water, because people nearby would grow water intensive crops, but those who are far away, they do not get that water, because dam is constructed in a certain region. So only people nearby that region, they get enough water, but not people in other areas. Vast area of agricultural land is compromised for construction of dams. Human habitation is also compromised, results in deforestation. So all of these are kind of related points, and all of these have a negative impact on the environment. It causes loss of biological diversity. Huge amount of public money is used without generation of proportionate benefits, because when we construct a dam, it is like a huge construction. You need huge amount of money to actually make it operational, but the benefits that we get out of it is not worth the money that was actually spent in building that up. So these are some of the negative things which are associated with too much construction of dams. So I think we should all be aware of that. So I think, yes, that was all for this lesson on natural resources. So with that, we have reached towards the end of our revision live video on biology class 10. So I have tried to cover all the important topics of all the chapters. And I do agree that there were certain topics which I could not discuss in detail, because this is just a revision video, right? So I do not want to reiterate the same thing, so that you should not feel that as if I have created the video for class 10 biology once again. And for all of those who have not watched the detailed videos of class 10 biology, I will provide the link of class 10 biology videos on examfear.com in the description section. So you definitely have a look at those videos, at least for the more important topics. And I think this live video, you should definitely watch it till the end, so that you get an idea about the entire syllabus. And for all of those who have actually covered your syllabus, this is going to be a very good way to revise your syllabus. So I hope that you found this video helpful, and I wish you all the very best for your exams.